The clock on the wall of Rosie's diner ticked steadily, its hands inching closer to the end of another night shift. The small, sleepy town of Pine Hollow was mostly quiet by this hour, its streets empty and its residents tucked away in their beds. The hum of the refrigerator, the occasional clink of a coffee cup, and the low murmur of the old radio in the corner were the only sounds that kept me company. It was past 3 a.m., and I was finishing up my nightly routine, wiping down the counters, stacking the chairs, and preparing the diner for the morning crew. I'd worked the night shift at Rosie's for nearly a year, and by now I was used to the solitude that came with it. Most nights, the silence was comforting, a time for me to collect my thoughts and enjoy the peace that came with the late hours. But tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't quite place it, but something was off. As I wiped down the last table, I heard it, a distant, mournful whistle that echoed through the streets. I paused, my hand frozen mid-wipe, and listened. The whistle was faint, but it sent a shiver down my spine. It was a sound I had never heard before, not in all my nights working there. I walked over to the window and peered out into the darkness. The street outside was empty, the only light coming from the flickering street lamp on the corner. But as I stood there, listening, the whistle came again, closer this time, louder. It was unmistakably the sound of a train, but there were no tracks near Pine Hollow. The nearest train line was miles away, and it certainly didn't run through the middle of town. Yet, as I strained my ears, I could hear the faint chugging of a steam engine, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks. A sense of unease settled over me. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face as I scanned the empty street. The sound of the train grew louder, as if it were approaching, but there was nothing. No tracks, no train, just the empty road and the silent buildings. And then, as the clock struck 3:15 a.m., I saw it. A ghostly train materialized out of the darkness, its form hazy and indistinct, like a mirage. The train was old, its engine a relic from a bygone era, billowing steam that dissipated into the night. The cars were dimly lit, their windows flickering with an eerie bluish light. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the phantom train as it rumbled past the diner. The whistle sounded again, a mournful wail that echoed through the streets, and I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to follow the train, to board it. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts, but the pull was strong, almost irresistible. My feet began to move on their own, carrying me toward the train as it slowed to a stop, just beyond the diner. The doors of one of the cars creaked open, revealing a dark, shadowy interior. For a moment, I felt a surge of panic, a voice in the back of my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run, but the pull was too strong, the compulsion too overwhelming. And then, just as I was about to step forward, the train began to move again. The door slammed shut and the engine roared to life, picking up a speed as it disappeared into the darkness. The whistle blew one last time, fading into the night as the train vanished from sight. I stood there, trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. The street was silenced once more, as if the train had never been there, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The phantom train was real, and it had almost claimed me. The next day at Rosie's diner was a blur. I went through the motions of my shift, serving customers, refilling coffee cups, and taking orders, but my mind was elsewhere. The memory of the phantom train haunted me, replaying in my mind over and over again. The eerie whistle, the ghostly engine, and the overwhelming compulsion to board. It all felt like a nightmare, but I knew it had been real. I tried to push the thoughts aside to focus on my work, but it was no use. The train had left a mark on me, a lingering sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I found myself glancing at the clock more often, dreading the approach of 3:15 a.m. As the night wore on, I grew more anxious. I kept looking out of the window, half expecting to see the train again, but the streets remained empty. The regular customers trickled out one by one, leaving me alone in the diner as the hour grew late. By the time 3 a.m. rolled around, the diner was silent once more. I busied myself with cleaning, trying to distract myself from the growing dread in the pit of my stomach, but as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was coming, something inevitable. The clock on the wall chimed softly, signaling the arrival of 3:15 a.m. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and listened. At first, there was nothing, just the low hum of the diner's lights and the faint buzz of the refrigerator. But then, faint and distant, I heard it, the mournful whistle of the phantom train. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The street outside was empty, just as it had been the night before, but the sound of the train grew louder, echoing through the streets, and I felt that same pull, that same compulsion to follow. And then, out of the darkness, the train appeared once more. It materialized in front of the diner, just as it had the previous night, its ghostly form shimmering in the dim light. The whistle blew again, and I felt the pull intensify, drawing me closer to the door. I knew I shouldn't go outside, shouldn't get closer to the train, but the compulsion was too strong. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, and stepped outside. The train was slowing to a stop, just as it had the night before. The doors of one of the cars creaked open, revealing the dark interior. I took a step forward, the pull almost unbearable now, as if some unseen force was dragging me toward the train. But this time, I resisted. I planted my feet firmly on the ground, forcing myself to stay put. The train's whistle wailed again, a desperate, mournful sound that seemed to call to me. But I didn't move. The doors remained open for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to board. And then, with a loud clang, they slammed shut. The engine roared to life, and the train began to move, picking up speed as it disappeared into the darkness once more. I stood there, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The street was silent again, but the pull, the compulsion to follow, still lingered, a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I knew I couldn't keep resisting the train's call forever. It would return, and each time the pull would be stronger, harder to resist. I needed to find out what the train wanted, why it was appearing to me, and why I felt so drawn to it. I had to uncover the truth before it was too late. The next morning, I decided to ask around town. Pine Hollow was small, and most of the residents knew each other's business. If the phantom train was real, if it had been seen before, surely someone would know something. I started with the regulars at the diner, those who had lived in Pine Hollow their whole lives, but when I mentioned the train, they just gave me puzzled looks, shaking their heads as if I was talking nonsense. No one had ever heard of a train passing through town, let alone a ghostly one. Frustrated but undeterred, I decided to visit the local library. The town's history was well documented there, and if the phantom train had any connection to Pine Hollow's past, I was determined to find it. The library was a small, quiet building near the center of town. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly librarian, greeted me with a warm smile as I walked in. She'd known me since I was a kid, and she was always happy to help with whatever I needed.
"Good morning, dear,"
she said, peering at me over her glasses.
"What brings you here today?"
"I'm looking for information about the town's history. I said, trying to keep my voice casual.
Specifically, anything about trains or railroads that might have run through here?
Mrs. Henderson frowned thoughtfully.
Well, there's never been a train line through Pine Hollow. As far as I know, the nearest tracks are miles away. But I can show you some old records and see if there's anything that might help.
He led me back to a room filled with dusty filing cabinets and old books. As she sorted through the files, I glanced around, taking in the musty smell of old paper and the quiet hum of the overhead lights. After a few minutes, Mrs. Henderson handed me a stack of old newspaper clippings and historical documents.
These are from the early 1900s, she said. There was a lot of development in the area back then, and it's possible that there was talk of building a railroad. You might find something useful here.
I thanked her and sat down at one of the tables, spreading out the documents in front of me. Most of the articles were about the town's early settlers, local businesses, and the construction of the main roads. But then I found something that caught my eye, a headline from 1912 that read, "Tragedy strikes at Pine Hollow Station." The article described a terrible accident that had occurred during the construction of a small train station on the outskirts of town. The station was part of a new rail line that was supposed to connect Pine Hollow to the large towns nearby. But before the line could be completed, a train carrying construction workers derailed, killing everyone on board. The project was abandoned after the accident, and the half-built station was left to decay. Over time, the story of the accident faded into local legend, and eventually, the station and the tracks were forgotten. As I read the article, a chill ran down my spine. Could this be connected to the phantom train? Was the train that had appeared to me somehow tied to the tragedy that had occurred over a century ago? I needed to know more. I searched through the rest of the documents, but there was no further mention of the train or the station. It was as if the town had erased the memory of the tragedy, burying it beneath years of forgotten history. But I wasn't about to give up. I decided to visit the site of the old station, hoping to find some clue that would help me understand the train's connection to the past. The site of the old station was on the outskirts of town, hidden away in the thick forest that had grown up around it over the years. I drove as far as I could, then parked my car and continued on foot, following the directions from the article. The forest was dense and overgrown, the path barely visible under the tangled underbrush. As I pushed my way through the trees, I felt a growing sense of unease. The air was heavy with a scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the rustling of the wind through the branches. After what felt like eternity, I finally emerged into a small clearing. There, half buried beneath the undergrowth, were the remnants of the old station. The wooden platforms had long since rotted away, and the tracks were rusted and twisted, barely recognizable beneath the moss and vines that had overtaken them. I walked around the clearing, searching for any sign of the train or the accident that had occurred here, but there was nothing, just the silent ruins of a forgotten project, abandoned to time. But then, as I was about to give up, I saw it, a small, weathered plaque, half hidden beneath a pile of leaves. I brushed away the debris and squinted at the faded lettering. In memory of those who lost their lives on this site, May 15th, 1912, their spirits shall forever ride the rails. A shiver ran down my spine as I read the inscription. The connection was clear. The phantom train was somehow tied to the spirits of those who had died in the accident, forever bound to the tracks that had claimed their lives. But why had the train appeared to me? Why was I being drawn to it? As I pondered these questions, the air around me seemed to grow colder and the light began to fade. I glanced at my watch. It was 3 p.m., still hours away from sunset, but the shadows were lengthening and a thick mist was beginning to rise from the ground, swirling round the trees like ghostly tendrils. The pull I had felt the past 2 nights returned, stronger than ever. It tugged at my chest, urging me to stay, to wait for the train to appear. I could almost hear the whistle, faint and distant, echoing through the trees, but I knew better than to stay. I turned and hurried back the way I had come, fighting against the pool with every step. The mist thickened around me, the trees closing in, but I pushed on, desperate to escape the clearing. Finally, I broke free of the forest and stumbled back to my car, gasping for breath. The pool had lessened, but it was still there, a nagging sensation in the back of my mind, urging me to return. But I knew I couldn't go back, not yet. I needed to know more, needed to understand what the train wanted from me before I could face it again. I drove back to town, my mind racing with questions. What was the connection between the train and the accident? Why was I being drawn to it? And most importantly, how could I break the pull before it claimed me as its next victim? That night, I returned to Rosie's diner, determined to stay away from the phantom train. I had made up my mind to quit the night shift and leave Pine Hollow for good. Whatever the train wanted, I wasn't going to let it take me. But as the clock ticked closer to 3:15 a.m., I felt the pull again, stronger than ever. It was as if the train knew I was trying to escape, and it wasn't going to let me go. The whistle sounded louder than before, echoing through the diner. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to resist, but the compulsion was too strong. My feet moved on their own, carrying me to the door. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The train was already there, waiting for me, its ghostly form shimmering in the darkness. The doors creaked open, and the pull became unbearable. I knew I couldn't fight it any longer. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the train, my heart pounding in my chest. The mist swirled around me, the air thick with the scent of steam and smoke. As I approached the train, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear and dread that had plagued me for days seemed to fade away, replaced by a sense of inevitability. This was my fate. There was no escaping it. I climbed aboard the train, the door slamming shut behind me. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the flickering lamps that lined the walls. The seats were old and worn, the upholstery torn and faded, but there was no one else on board, just me and the ghostly presence that filled the car. The train began to move, the wheels clattering on the tracks as it picked up speed. I sat down, my hands trembling, and stared out of the window. The town of Pine Hollow passed by in a blur, the lights flickering in the distance. And then, as the train sped through the night, the truth hit me. The train wasn't taking me away. It was bringing me back. Back to the moment of the accident. Back to the place where it all began. The mist outside the window thickened, and the train's whistle wailed, a mournful sound that echoed through the darkness. I felt the pull grow stronger, drawing me deeper into the past, into the tragedy that had claimed so many lives. The train hurtled forward, the landscape outside warping and twisting. The world around me faded, replaced by the dark, shadowy figures of the passengers who had died in the accident. They were all there, their faces pale and lifeless, their eyes empty. And then I saw it, the moment of the crash. The train derailed, the cars tumbling off the tracks, the sound of metal screeching against metal filling the air. The passengers screamed, their voices lost in the chaos. And then, silence. The train slowed to a stop, the ghostly passengers fading into the mist. I was alone again, the car empty and silent. The pool was gone, replaced by deep, overwhelming sadness. The train had brought me here to witness its final moments, to show me the tragedy that had bound it to the tracks for all eternity. And now, it was over. The train began to move again, slowly this time, carrying me back to Pine Hollow. The mist cleared, the town coming back into view. The whistle sounded one last time. A final farewell as the train came to a stop in front of the diner. The doors creaked open and I stepped off the train, the cold night air hitting my face. The train was gone, the tracks empty once more. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where the train had been, the pool finally gone. The clock on the diner's wall struck 3:30 a.m., and the world around me was silent. The phantom train had claimed its last victim. Its journey was over, its passengers finally at rest. And I, too, was free.